it's very exciting for me just to even see your face because I have to share with you that I'm a sociologist by training, so I taught sociology for so many years in higher ed, and there wasn't a class that I taught where I didn't use your documentary, The Eye of the Storm, in the class and watch you and the children in your classroom over and over again. It was my favorite foundational lesson. It was showing my students what you were teaching about race and about how we can quickly create a microcosm of the world in a classroom so quickly. So just to
And,
sit here with
and the
you is exciting.
We're still doing it every day in classrooms all over the United States of America. And every time they turn on the television, they are being exposed to blatant racism, sexism, ageism, and homophobia. If I were educating educators today, I would say make sure that your students not do not watch more than an hour of television every day. Turn them on to books and give them prizes if they. And that's what I did. And when I was teaching third grade, and then when I was teaching junior high, the kids got prizes for not watching television after school because it is so full of stuff that they should not be told.
That's you're right. Just spot on. And I'm realizing as you were talking, we're going to have a lot of people watching this and they may not even know what I'm talking about when I say the eye of the storm or your work, the book that you wrote, A Collar in My Pocket. So I'm diving in with just love bombing you right off the start, just telling you how special you are. But I want to back up then and give a little background to you before we even dive into all these different avenues that we're going to talk about education and Orton-Gillingham and so forth. So, even to back it up for someone who doesn't know your book, hasn't seen the documentary that I'm speaking of, how would you how do you introduce yourself, Jane, and your background? How do you best describe yourself? If you don't mind, I'm going to turn that over to you to describe.
Well, I was born a racist of a casual Catholic mother and a believing Baptist father. And I was taught that if you're white, you're all right. And it wasn't until I married a man who had very brown, big brown eyes and dark hair, and he worked for National Tea Store, and he was transferred to Waterloo, Iowa, and his store was in the north end of Waterloo, Iowa, which was called the N-word section of town. And we learned once he went into that store, we learned that everything we had been taught about people who were other than white was a lie, because the most fabulous experiences he had were those that he had with his his customers in that National Seafood store. And it wasn't until he lost his one so-called black employee who wanted to go to college that the local NAACP picketed his store, and that made the people who owned the store in Chicago, who owned the store, angry. So they closed that store and opened a new store across the river. And my husband said to them, "Don't put that store across the river. These people will not drive across the river to buy their groceries. Many of them don't have cars. You're going to lose these customers." They knew what they were doing. They were sure that they could do this. They put it across the river. They lost all their customers. Daryl lost his job because the store went bust, obviously, because he had no customers. So then we moved back to Riceville, Iowa, and it was there that I went back into teaching. And then I really learned what racism is about, because the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, which makes me sick to think about it, I put my students, my blue-eyed white students, mostly blue-eyed, through a lesson in discrimination based on the color of their eyes, because eye color and skin color are caused by the same chemical in our bodies, which is melanin. So if you have a lot of melanin in your body, your skin is very dark, your eyes are dark, and your hair is dark. If you only have a little, if you have only a little melanin, you probably have blue eyes and pale skin and pale hair. And I didn't know what I was doing because I didn't really know about racism because I'd been raised white, until I put my kids through that blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise. And unfortunately for me, the brown-eyed kids were on top the first day, and I had blue eyes. And immediately I found out what it's like to be on the receiving end of racism. I couldn't believe what my students were willing to say and do where I was concerned because of my having been born, unfortunately, with blue eyes. I learned more that day than I had ever taught before, and I have never taught the same ever since because I learned about being treated in a racist way by students who were 9 years old and I was 33, and they could put me down very easily because I had the wrong color eyes. It was absolutely astounding. The first day, the blue eyed people were on the bottom, the brown eyed people were on the top. I went back to school the next day knowing that the blue eyed people were going to be on the top, the brown eyed people were going to be on the bottom. I dreaded going back to school. When I went through that exercise the next day, those brown eyed kids were less vicious to the blues than the blues had been to them, and I didn't know why. And so on Tuesday, after, when we discussed the exercise, I asked those blue eyed kids, why didn't you kids get even? They said, because we found out how it feels to be on the bottom, and we didn't want to make anybody feel as bad as we did when we were on the bottom. Now, if pale faces in this country could just realize that people who are of a darker skin color, darker brown, because we are all shades of brown, this is another thing I learned. There are no white people, there are no black people, there are no red or yellow human beings on the face of the earth. We all come in shades of brown. You are a shade of brown, so am I. My skin, you can tell where my skin stops and my shirt begins. And you can tell where my hair stops and my skin begins, because this is white and this is white, but this is not. This is a shade of brown. We've got to get it into our kids and into our physicians and into our obstetricians and into nurses that we are all shades of brown. There are no black people, there are no white people. Now that'll make every person on the face of the earth, no, in the United States, angry, because we are so we are so tied to that antisocial construct of race. And race is not a social construct, it's an antisocial construct. It was created deliberately to make those who had lighter skin more powerful than those who had darker skin. It was made up during the Spanish Inquisition by a man named Torquemada, and everybody needs to read about Torquemada and realize how really stupid this whole thing is. Now, should I shut up?
No, because what you so in the you did this experiment and then eventually front
Exercise. No, no, please
exercise.
don't call it an experiment because it's
Correct.
illegal and it's unethical to experiment with people without their knowledge or their permission.
Correct.
These kids knew what we were going to do because we had discussed it, and they agreed to go along with this exercise in empathy. Okay?
Okay. Exercise and empathy. That's right. And that exercise then was filmed and documented by I don't know if the name was Frontline, but they came in and they filmed your this class exercise in racism, and that's that really put this whole topic on the map, right? That it was called Eye of the Storm, or I used to read it the heading as Class Divided, but you said it's called The Eye of the Storm. If someone wanted to
The
Google this,
first The first film was made by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and I don't think it's ever been shown in this country. And I took that. They sent me a copy of that. That was the year after I did the exercise. They came in. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation sent a film crew in, and they filmed my third graders going through the exercise. They sent me a copy of that film. I took it up and showed it to my parents in the hotel that we owned in Riceville at that time. My father was sitting there watching this film, and he was about 60 years old, I think, at 59 or 60 years old. He sat there and he watched that. And when it was over, he stood up, took his red handkerchief out of the back pocket of his bib overalls, blew his nose, wiped his eyes, and said, I wish somebody had taught me that when I was 9 years old.
hmm,
Now, any sociologist or any psychologist who says that exercise is harmful to children, every time I hear that and every time someone attacks me for abusing those children with that exercise, I think of my father saying, I wish somebody had taught me that when I was 9 years old. It would have changed the way he lived his life. It would have changed the way he raised his children. It would have changed the way he had friends and how he chose them. But he didn't know until he was about 60. And after that, you could not tell a racist joke around my father. He wouldn't laugh. He wouldn't even listen. He'd finally say, are you going to tell that joke here? If you are, I'll go out in the other room. He wouldn't put up with it because he realized that racism is not something you're born with, it's something you learn. And you have to be carefully, carefully taught to be a racist. And in this country, we know how to teach racism. We teach that Columbus discovered America. Well, number one, you can't discover a place where people are already living. They discovered it before you got there. But we don't want to admit, and we won't admit, that people from Africa, we say invaded, but discovered this land 15,000 years before Columbus was a gleam in his father's eye. Now, that isn't something we're taught in school. We are taught that Columbus discovered America. It is a flat out lie. We need to stop telling it. I didn't know until I did the exercise how ignorant I was, nor how badly I was educating students. I wasn't educating students, I was teaching them facts that weren't really facts. That's not education. And educate, that word educator comes from the duck deuce, which means lead, the prefix e, which means out, the suffix ate, which means the act of, and the suffix or, which means one who does. An educator is one who is engaged in leading people out of ignorance. You can't do that if you're still teaching that Columbus discovered America. Not even if you say, well, he discovered it for the Western countries. No, he didn't discover it at all. He came here and invaded a country that was owned by a whole lot of different tribes, or what we would call cults of people. It's time to start telling the truth. I learned more that day than I wanted to know. I learned that I was a racist. I didn't want to know that. I would have sworn that I wasn't a racist until I did the exercise and I watched my third graders become me, become what they had learned from people like me. And I thought, oh my God, how can you teach something that you don't know? If you don't know about it, how can you teach about it? And that's what we were trying to do. So we were teaching that if you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, hang around. If you're black, get back. You know that, and I know that. If you're yellow, you're mellow, and if you're red, you're dead. Because we had, after the Spanish Inquisition, we divided people by skin color. We talked about black and white and red and yellow. People don't come in those skin colors. We all come in shades of brown. It took me a long time to learn that. And if you doubt it, then you go to the National Geographic magazine for April of 2018. Buy that magazine and read it. And put the pictures that are in there, have them laminated and put them on your wall so that people realize that we are indeed all shades of brown.
It reminds me of that book, The Myth of Race by Robert
Yes,
Sussman,
yes,
right?
yes. Yep. That
And
if you would just read the first chapter and the last page of the last chapter of Robert L. Sussman's book, The Myth of Race, they would know that this is a social, antisocial construct, and it's time to give it up. It's absolutely time to give it up. We're playing we're playing catch up ball here. It's time to give it up.
right. I love the way you call it antisocial construct because it is antisocial versus a social construct. It is something that has been
A
created by
Right,
by
social
humans,
construct,
right?
right? But a social construct tries to bring us all together, tries to explain something and bring us together. An antisocial construct tries to keep us apart. And that's what
Absolutely.
racism is attempts to do, and sexism and ageism and homophobia all keep us apart, separates us. We want something that brings us together, and the idea of one race, all shades of brown, can bring us together.
Well, I remember in that documentary, this is before I knew you. I didn't know you. I would just watch this film and I would show it enough times. I remember you were saying I was ironing the teepee, and that would make me laugh
Yeah,
because you were saying I was ironing the teepee, and I just sensed you were teaching the children about the Native American story. I could just the love of the way you say I was ironing the teepee, and I thought, look what happened to Martin Luther King. I just remember your words in describing how you came up. I was going to introduce this exercise on racism to my class, and the students watching these little faces, these little children, and the things they said and the things you said to them. But at the very end, when both groups had experienced being discriminated against, I get chills thinking about it. How loving they were to each other and to you, how they trusted their teacher, how much they loved you as a teacher. I just, that was just me watching this whole thing unfold with the wisdom. Remember the one student, he said, you said, "How did you feel?" And he said, "I felt like a dog on a leash." I just remember
Yes,
him.
yeah. Greg. Yep, yep, yep. I
The
do.
things
Absolutely. Like a dog
that
leash.
Right, and that they would have to go home. One little girl said, "I went home and I didn't understand how this could be happening. The teacher who brought us together was all of a sudden doing this." And some of the children looked at you and said, "Well, how do you explain this? You have blue eyes." When you were
Yeah,
discriminating, right? They were so
right.
smart, the things that were being said. So I would watch this and I would see this example that you were showing in this exercise. You're right, there was no experiment about it. It was an exercise of how you could create in a within minutes, seconds almost, this microcosm of dynamics that would allow
Yeah,
one group to discriminate against another group just by your tone, by your saying you can't drink from the water fountain, you have to use the cup, and you'd say, "Look at so and so." Is that, and a child would have his head down, and you'd say,
yeah.
right? You just, the way you did it was so brilliant, and the way that the children responded. And then I remember you saying that after the children went through the exercise, their scores actually improved, that their
Oh, it
cognitive
was
abilities went up, right? It's like you turned on
absolutely.
switches in their brain.
It flips a switch in the brains of those who are on the out, who are the out group. We flip that switch in their brains at birth. In fact, we do it prenatally. Women of color who are being treated in hospitals and by doctors in this country don't get the same treatment that pale faced women do. And we've got to stop using pale face and white and black. People, if you don't have much melanin in your skin, you must be melanemic. We've got to start using melanemic instead of white. We've got to start using melanotic instead of black. And we've got to start using melanaceous for those who are neither melanemic nor melanotic. The majority of the people on the face of the earth are melanaceous. They have melanin in their skin, but not enough to hurt them, but enough to keep them from being damaged by the rays of the sun. Being melanaceous is a good thing, and practically, and only 15 to 18% of the human population of the earth is classified as white. And that's a misnomer. We aren't white. We are melanemic. The majority of the people on the face of the earth are melanaceous. At the other end are those who are melanotic. It's when we're using words melanemic, melanaceous, and melanotic, we are using words that are neither positive nor negative. They are simply a description of how much melanin there is in our skin. And we all came onto this earth at the beginning, 300,000 years ago. We were all melanotic. All our ancestors were extremely melanotic, but as they moved farther and farther from the equator, their bodies produced less and less melanin because they were exposed to less and less sunlight. So their hair, their skin, and their eyes got lighter. That's the only reason I have this light skin, and that's the only reason you have the light skin that you have, is because your ancestors moved away from the left Africa and managed to populate every landmass on the face of the earth without any modern technology. And those were people whose skin was very, very dark. Now, in this country, and particularly now today, it's getting worse. Racism is worse today than I have seen it since in the last 55 years. It is absolutely growing at a huge rate because of our of a certain group of people who want to absolutely defend the myth of several races. There's only one race of human beings on the face of the earth. We are all Homo sapiens, and there's only one color group. We're all shades of brown. I didn't know that. And then I found it out. And now it's time for all of us to find it out. We've got to get over this nonsense of racism.
Well, even I remember there being an article in the Washington Post. I don't have it with me. I wish I did, but there was a group of scientists who said they did a bad job. They were admitting to doing a bad job, not establishing through the genetic research that's been done that there's only one race. There's no difference
Yes.
between race. Said they actually admitted in this article that they have done a very bad job in allowing this myth of some beings, some genetic difference, there's no genetic difference, right? Other than what you're saying about the tone of skin, but this idea that there's these races of difference genetically is simply untrue scientifically. But
Well,
we
but it's a lie that has made a lot of money. You have to realize that
totally
racism is an extremely profitable venture. We need to know that
correct,
you can make a lot if you promote racism. But we need also to
correct.
remember that the word race, meaning a separate group of people, came out of France in 1580. Think about that.
See,
It's only been
see,
since
correct,
1580 that the word race meant a specific group of people. Now, these scientists were just teaching what they'd learned. They hadn't learned from people of color as much as they needed to learn. People of color,
correct,
if you read the book Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, you will be so amazed by what we so-called white folks didn't know because we didn't think we had to learn from anybody who didn't look like us. Yeah,
correct.
everybody has to read that.
And it's such an interesting thing because I was debating sharing this, but I'm going to go ahead and share it in light of what you're saying. See, for me, for example, we all have our stories. We all have our ancestral line that we come from. So for me, my mother was Armenian, and my grandparents survived the Armenian genocide. And I grew up in a very ethnic family. My grandmother came over at 13. She was sold to my grandfather, who came over before her. He saw his whole family beheaded and killed. And so I had these very traumatized grandparents that crawled out from this horrific genocide, and a mother who was raised up in Rhode Island in a very
Oh,
ethnic community of Armenians, right? Parents that they didn't speak English, and she was being raised here. Now, this we're going to circle back into this because my mother learned to read and write even though her parent and she was dirt poor, right? Dirt poor, ethnic parents, traumatized people, and she could spell, read, and write far better than me, and raised in Northern Virginia in an affluent DC suburb, right? Now, what's interesting in light of what you're saying too, and this is going to sound weird because the viewer would think, she's white, right? And I never felt white because I felt so ethnic. And people would say to
right.
me, "Oh, your skin is darker." Like I would have very olive skin or darker skin. I had very dark hair. This is white now, but it was, pitch black, dark eyes. And I felt very discriminated against because I was so
Mm-hmm.
ethnic at the time, right? So this idea, and my grandmother was sold, and I listened to all these stories, and here I am in this form, identifying with different races, right? And the tragedy stories. But someone would look at me and think, "Oh, there's this white person of privilege." They wouldn't have no idea the underneath story of
Right,
what, right? So
right.
my mother's best friend was a one Maggie, who was like a second mother to me, and she was black. She was raised in Culpeper, Virginia, and she would tell me the stories of how she would go and get water from the spring for her grandfather, who was a slave. I mean, these are
Uh,
people. You touch the hand who touched the hand. Just Margaret Rawson, who we're meeting over, it was born in 1899. So her father was too young to fight in the Civil War. I mean, we are
oh,
just generation or two outside of this, or some of us, I'm sure, have met people in our lifetime who know who have been held and touched by people living in these eras that we feel are so long ago, but they weren't. When I was selling my
yeah.
parents' house in Northern Virginia, I was looking at the deed because my parents had passed. In the write-up of home sales, it said you couldn't sell property in these neighborhoods outside DC to Negroes,
Mm-hmm.
Armenians, and Syrians.
Right.
And so,
Right.
like, I was part of the group you couldn't sell the property to. So, what is this pigment thing that we're talking about, right? When you, right?
It's literally all in our heads. It's all in
Correct.
our head. And we need to knock it out and we need to replace it with the truth. We
Right.
need to
So,
replace the idea of black and white with melanemic, melanaceous, and melanotic shades of brown. We've got to replace this with shades of brown. And everybody should have one of these stickers that says we are all shades of brown because this is what we are. These are all our colors. There are no red or yellow or white or black hands in those raised hands. We are all shades of brown. We've got to get that into our kids prenatally. We've got to get it to them the minute they enter preschool or any form of communication with any other human being. They have to be able to look at every human being and say, "Oh, you are," and then get a word. Go to the thesaurus. Look up all the synonyms for brown and white and black. There are about 30 synonyms for white, about 35 for black, and 180 synonyms for brown. Now, if you would send your students to the thesaurus, have them find a color that seems to match the color of their skin. They'll find a shade of brown that matches the color of their skin. If I were teaching third grade today, that's what I would do. And my kids would be wearing these things that say we're all shades of brown because that's what we are. We're all members of the same race and we're all shades of brown. And what's even more frightening is teachers judge students by their skin color. And dyslexic boys who are of a darker shade of brown are more likely to end up in prison than are those who are of a lighter shade of brown and dyslexic. I have watched
totally.
that thing happen. I see racism in how dyslexic males are treated all day, every day, because most teachers
Totally.
don't know how to teach the dyslexic child. They call that child not very bright. They call that child a, a behavior problem when in fact he's not the problem. Teachers who don't know how to teach the dyslexic boys are what are the problem. We've mislabeled the problem once again. Now,
You,
I know we're supposed to be talking about something else, but you can't
no,
talk
it's
about racism without talking about sexism and the teachers who force students, particularly male students of color, to live down to their expectations of them. And
totally.
that's the worst thing that can happen to a dyslexic male is to have a teacher who doesn't know anything about Orton-Gillingham phonics. And I learned about Orton-Gillingham phonics from the people who Margaret Rawson taught.
I cannot wait to get into that. I'm going to I just cannot wait because the thing that um, I want to share is that you had come to the college. I was teaching at Hood College at the time in Frederick, Maryland, and some division at the college had invited you as a speaker. And so I was so excited. I had my class come and there you were speaking. I'll never forget this, Jane. There you were up there speaking, and I was with my class. It was like heaven. And you said in the middle of your presentation, "Are you teaching Orton-Gillingham here at this college?" And I thought I about fell off my chair because right in front of me was the president of the college. And I had just met with her about teaching Orton-Gillingham at the college. That's a whole other discussion. What happened? Margaret had tried, she had taught at Hood College for years. She had tried to get them to teach Orton-Gillingham. In fact, Margaret taught the first language re education course in the country, essentially Orton-Gillingham, through the sociology department because they weren't open to it in the education department.
Right.
And
And
I
still
had just,
aren't.
no, they still aren't. Absolutely not. And I was having Orton Fellows come in and teaching Orton-Gillingham to students that I was placing in the community doing volunteer work on literacy intervention programs. But I had just seen the president and the academic dean and two people from the education department trying to get them to teach this in the school. It went nowhere. And there you were, this speaker saying, "Are you teaching Orton-Gillingham?" I think she thought it was a rigged deal. I'm sure she did. I
But
thought it was a rigged deal. I just couldn't believe you were. And then it struck me. Jane, it struck me. All those videos I watched of you over and over again, of course you had those word lists. The way you were having them do their handwriting on the board, the way you were teaching a phonetic principle the way you were. I thought, shit, there it is. She's teaching Orton-Gillingham to this whole class of kids, and I missed it.
but
I couldn't believe it. So you said, this is what you said. You said, um, that about Orton-Gillingham, and I had to take that in. And then you said at the end, you're very tired. You don't want to take any questions from anybody. Please don't come up and ask you a bunch of questions at the end. So I boldly went up to you at the end. I didn't heed your your request, and I said, "Did I hear you say Orton-Gillingham?" And you said, "Yes." I said, "Have you heard of Margaret Ross?" And you said, "She's my shero." I said, "Oh my God, Margaret lives right down the road from here. Do you want to meet her tomorrow?" You said, "Yes, you could meet her tomorrow." So I took you to Margaret's house. That's the beginning of
yes,
our
yes.
connection. I mean, I just wanted to share that because that was like this incredible moment. And you know, to circle back to what you said, I just want to circle back because only life works this way. This issue of reading and literacy and what is happening to young Black male students of color, it's a horrific thing to watch. There is an issue in this. There is a structural proof of a systemic problem when it comes to reading and dyslexia for all children, but particularly children of color and particularly males. I have seen it. I know what you're talking about. And we'll get into the nuts and bolts of that because what I wanted to share when you were saying that, what brought me, and I want to hear how you got into this Orton-Gillingham, because were you trained by Jean Osmond or Paula Rome? Which one?
Paula Rome and Gene Osmond both.
Both.
They worked
You had the
together in
treasures.
Rochester,
Okay.
Minnesota.
You had the
Ah,
treasures. Okay.
yes,
And
I
they
did.
were best friends with Margaret. And Paula Rome,
Yep.
her uncle, Paul Dozier, is who,
Paul Rome,
in
Paul knows your Rome, right?
yes, that's who informally trained Margaret. So for the listener, let's just regroup this for a minute. Margaret Rawson was born in 1899. 1899. So I am blessed to have my mentor born in 1899. Here we are in
Mm-hmm.
2025, right? And the brilliance of these early educational pioneers, these people who touched your life, who touched my life, put into our head an awareness of certain principles that then, just like your kids in your classroom, it ignites, it opens up an awareness, right? You were bold and beautiful to do that exercise with your students. And you can't help but see a race issue traveling along in public education or in education in general, and the structural barrier to access to literacy, which is the most important thing to liberate anybody, right? I
Right,
mean, it's
right.
what liberates. So when I got into this because my two boys were very dyslexic, and
Ah,
the two incredibly dyslexic boys, and it turns out I'm dyslexic, their dad's dyslexic, but no one, I wasn't identified, right? Back then, right? Could never spell. I don't know how I cracked the reading code. I managed to. But here's something to put on the table too, and we can circle into it. But I just want your ears to hear this, and I'm just going to say it. When my boys were in school, they had a principal in the public system. She was African American. She was a woman of color, and she wrote on a. I was trying to figure out what was going on with my kids, and she actually, Jane, believe this. I can't believe this. She had written on a little piece of paper and she wrote the word dyslexia, and she had it all folded up and
Oh,
she handed it to me. This is what I think is wrong with your children. And I opened it up and had the word dyslexia on it. And I was like, what the hell is this? But I had met Margaret and she was starting to take me up a learning curve about this and how it's not a learning disability, it's a teaching disability.
mm.
I know
No,
the
it's a learning
international,
difference. It's a learning
it's a
difference.
learning difference. And you know what?
That's right.
Here's what I came up with. I know the International Dyslexia Association is coming up with a new definition for dyslexia. But to me, I would say it's a teaching disability that can't accommodate for individual differences. Like it just, they can't accommodate to the different brain architectures that are going on out there. But anyway, um,
No, no, wait a minute, wait a minute. It's not that they can't accommodate, it's that they refuse to accommodate. They
good
don't
point.
have to accommodate. It is not part of their contract. All they're contracted for is 180 days of work, of teaching. They are not contracted for education. There's a big difference between teaching and
That's true.
education.
You're so true. Margaret would say, you train a dog, you educate a human being, and education
That's
is
right.
what you want, right? You don't want this,
That's right.
right? But here's the thing, Jane. So I said, my children need a very phonetic approach. I learned that from Margaret. That's when
Mm-hmm.
I met her, she said there's a key, but it's very phonetic. And my response was, we don't hear those sounds in my family. It was like a phonological test without knowing it. And but I said to the principal, my children are going to need a very phonetic approach. And you know what she said to me? She said, you're white, you're middle class, and you all want phonics. I'm like, what the hell does that mean? Like, I couldn't wrap
Oh,
my head around this. So there's some elements in here that have to be put on the table too. And this is very political, but I don't care. I'm speaking honestly from my heart. There is dynamics to this phenomenon of oppression or discrimination. And one of them is internalized racism. Internalized
right.
racism.
Right.
And the phenomenon of becoming the very barrier to adding, even though you're a person of color, you're adding to the problem by internalizing and believing these myths. So to think that middle class white people want phonics and to put that in race terms was very bizarre from this principal who didn't understand what all children needed. She had lots of children in that school, children of color, children what under the heading of white, they all needed to be taught to read. And she's dividing it by race, which is a form of racism herself, adding to this confusion in this. So I have seen
But wait a
different.
minute, wait a minute. That's what we don't seem to realize. When you teach people that being a certain color makes you superior, it isn't only the ones who consider themselves superior who internalize that crap. We teach that to everyone. So we,
Correct.
we teach racism not just to white people, but also we teach racism to people who are melanotic or melanaceous but believe this crap about being melanemic. And so they
Correct.
behave the way we teach them to behave, and they live down to our expectations of them. That's the
Totally.
reason we have change. Words are the most powerful weapon devised by humankind. We use words to destroy people from the moment before they're born. We use words to destroy them. As long as we have people who believe in whiteness and blackness, we will have racism. It's time for us to stop using those two words and use brown for all of us.
But
Shut
you
up,
know,
Jane. I can shut up
no,
now.
Jane, you're here's the thing, you already said it. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of
Oh,
profit made off of this divide and this lack of awareness and children thrown under the bus, literally under the school
right.
bus that are suffering from this being perpetuated by anyone on the continuum of the color code, right? Like anybody on that continuum is capable of perpetuating this. So here was this principle breaking this down by race in a way that was nuts, right? So I'm just putting it out there because I have seen it all. I've experienced it, right? Like someone may say to me, because I would teach courses in race and gender and age, all these courses I've been teaching for years, and it is only getting worse. It is
Right,
only getting worse, and a lot of it is
right.
perpetuated by the educational elite who are not understanding the dynamics of this. It's like that Washington Post article where the scientists were saying, we should have done a better job explaining there is no genetic difference. We minimize, and I don't know what the politics were for them to minimize the truth about the difference that there's one race genetically, but they
But
needed
you can't have black slaves if you realize that those black people are our 30th to 50th cousins.
right,
If you realize that those are our 30th to 50th cousins, then you'll have to stop treating them as less than, because
right,
we're all members of the same family. Oh my God, we're all homosexuals and Homo sapiens. And when I say Homo sapiens to these boys and the ones that Mr. T. Rump leads, they think I'm saying homosexuals. I'm saying Homo sapiens. We are all sapiens, every one of us. And
right,
if we would just get that into our heads, then the fact that we are all shades of brown would make sense, because we all
right.
came from Africa originally. Our ancestors, our ancient ancestors, all came from Africa, where there was lots of sunlight, so our bodies produced lots and lots of melanin. If people could just get that into their heads, I'll never forget the woman I was in her home, and her daughter came outside, and her mother said to her, "Get back in the house, you're black enough." And I thought, what? And then I realized she didn't want her child to get any tanner, and the minute she went outside, she got tanner. She'd get back in the house, you're black enough. Think about that. At the same
Think
time
about,
that
well,
my
that's
sister,
what I'm talking about. That
yeah,
they, and
yeah,
that's often an unspoken truth about the dynamics of this, which is how humans, people in whatever shade of brown, are capable of buying into this and perpetuating
that's
it,
right.
so that's very, very important to put out there, especially as we go into this. So now the piece that first of all, just to back up, how did you get exposed to this thing called Orton-Gillingham? And we will make the connections between all these things as we go along. But how did you get introduced to, who did you meet first, Paula or Jean?
Neither one. I was walking down the street in my hometown one day, and the veterinarian's wife, I was walking by her house, and she came out and said, "Jane, I need to talk to you." I said, "Okay." So I went in the house, and she said, "Now, you teach third grade." I said, "Right." She said, "You're a good third grade teacher." I said, "Well, I think I am." She said, "I want my son to be in your classroom." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because he's severely dyslexic. And I want you to read the social studies and science to him, read the story problems in math to him, and I'm taking him to Rochester, Minnesota twice a week to have Gene Osmond and Paula Rome teach him how to read." I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "My son is dyslexic. He's severely dyslexic, and he cannot learn to read unless he's taught using Orton-Gillingham phonics. Will you agree not to teach him to read?" I said, "Absolutely. I'll be pleased not to teach him to read. I'll ask that your child be put in my class." So her child came into my classroom. When he came in, he's this tall, skinny, scared little boy, scared to death because he had been hit by teachers. By that time, he had been hit by the kindergarten teacher, the first grade teacher, and the second grade teacher. And I mean slapped either by hand or with a book, because he couldn't learn to read. He came in there just scared to death, just trembling almost. And I thought, what? Huh. And this scared little boy had psoriasis in the crook of his elbow, and his head was covered with psoriasis. When he walked, it was like a snowstorm when he walked by you, because he was so nervous. By the time he left that classroom, I watched him every day, twice a week. His mother would come and get him and take him to Rochester, Minnesota to learn how to read. I watched that kid learn how to read. I didn't teach him to read. I watched him learn how to read from Paula Rome and Gene Osmond. At the end of the year, he was reading at or above the third grade level. He only had a little spot of psoriasis in the crook of his elbow, and he was walking tall and strong. He changed drastically in one year because those women knew how to teach him how to read. and he learned to read, and he graduated from high school in good shape. I watched what happened with that kid at the end of the year. At the end of the year, I said, "Okay, I'm taking the course in Orton-Gillingham phonics because there's no way I can continue to teach if I don't know what Paula Rome knows." So I took the course under Paula Rome and Jean Osmond, and from that time on, I taught kids how to read. And the reason the film was made in my classroom is the principal. 2 years later, I think it was 2 years later, the principal handed me my class roll before school started at a teacher's lounge, a teacher's meeting, and he said, "Now, these kids are never going to learn to read. Pass them on and get them out of here. They'll never amount to anything anyway. Nobody else has been able to teach them to read, and neither will you. Just don't worry about it. Just teach them what you can." I thought, well, you silly. And I thought really unpleasant things. And then I went into the office and looked at their records. And here in their records, I saw that every one of those 16 kids had high math scores, low reading and spelling scores. And I started to laugh. And I was laughing when I walked out of the
Uh,
superintendent's, the principal's office, and the person sitting there said, "What's so funny?" I said, "Mr. B just gave me the best gift I've ever gotten. He just gave me a whole bunch of kids that are going to go from first grade reading to fifth grade reading in 1 year." She said, "That can't happen." I said, "Oh, yes, it can, because I know how to teach the dyslexic child how to read." And I said, "Every one of these kids matches what we see in dyslexic people." And I went back to my classroom. When those kids came into the classroom that year, they were all just scared to death, just like frightened little fawns. They came in because they'd heard what a
uh,
terrible person I was. And, and I said, "Well, now, every one of you kids are here because you have problems learning to read, right?" They said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, let me show you something." I put the word on the board. And I said, "What is that?" Some of them said no, some of them said on, some of them said nothing. So I put up the word was. Some of them said was, some of them said saw, some of them said nothing. I said, "See, here's the problem. You kids have a reading difference, not a disability. You aren't low IQ. You're very high IQ if you can succeed in spite of having this learning difference. Now, I know how to teach to that learning difference. If you do exactly what I tell you to, by the end of this year, you'll be reading at from the fourth to the sixth grade level." And they looked at each other like, "See, she is crazy. Everybody says so." And I said to him, "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" "Yeah, everybody." I said, "I know what everybody says, but they're wrong. I'm not crazy. I know how to teach reading. Now, I'm going to teach you how to read." And those kids went from the first grade level to the fourth or fifth, and one of them, a couple of them were reading at the sixth, at their independent reading level. By the end of the year was the sixth grade level. Here they had all this intelligence, all those years, all that time, kindergarten, first, second grade, and they got into third grade. For some of them, this was their fourth year in school because their previous teachers hadn't known how to teach the dyslexic. Every one of those
right.
kids should have been reading at the fourth grade level when they came to my classroom. When they graduated, and then 10 years after they graduated from high school, they asked me to come and meet with them, so I did. One was a lawyer, had become a lawyer. The other was a junior and senior high school principal, and they were all just grinning all over their faces because here we are, Mrs. Elliott. I said, "You can't be you. You weren't ever supposed to succeed." They said, "Well, we did," and they're laughing, and I'm laughing, and it was like, oh my! And then last August, a year
Uh,
ago, that same group of kids called and said, "Kids." And they said, "Hey, will you meet with us?" I said, "Yeah, but not on Saturday. I'll meet with you on Sunday." So I went over to the school on Sunday, went into the building in which they had learned to read. And here were these old people coming in. My God, they're 62, 63 years old. And they walked in. And I said, "Where are my students?" And we all just howled because here
God,
we are. We're all this many years older, and the lawyer has retired from the law, and the junior and senior high school principal has gone into another line of work because he needed to make money. And here were all these people. 11 of those 16, I think it was 11, had succeeded and made it. And before we got done, one of them was sitting there, the one who had been a high school, junior and senior high school principal, said, "What happened was you taught us the truth, Mrs. Elliott. You just taught us the truth." And I taught them the truth, that they weren't dumb, they weren't less than, they had
totally.
a learning difference. And if you know how to teach that learning difference, you can teach 99% of the students in your classroom. And if you don't know
Totally.
how to teach learning difference, you should not be in education. You should
I
change jobs because you are
I
doing more
love you.
harm
You're
than good.
absolutely right. You're so right. Because honest, the sad thing is, teachers they go and spend all this money for a degree, and they don't know what they're not being taught to prepare them. They buy the
And if they don't,
mythology.
if they don't, then that BS is BS, and that
Correct.
MS is more of the same. And that PhD is piled higher and deeper. If you can't
To-
teach the dyslexic child, you've got no business calling yourself an
totally.
educator.
Because the
And that
science,
and that
once,
not that
yeah,
difficult. Look, get this book. If you're strong, get this book. Everybody,
is,
get this
is
book.
that the manual? What is that?
This is the manual. This
The
is the manual for
manual.
teaching the dyslexic child how to
Anna
read.
Gillingham. Yep.
This
Is that
is the remedial training for children with specific disability in reading, spelling, and penmanship. Disability is a misnomer. Difference, reading difference. There's a reading differences in reading, spelling, and penmanship.
yep. That's right.
Yes, get this book. And you have to realize that right now they have taken cursive writing out of the schools. Worst
So
thing they could do for the dyslexic child. Do not take cursive writing out of the school, because cursive writing, a child who's dyslexic doesn't have to make a decision as to whether to make the B or a D, where to put the circle on the B or the D, because the B in
correct.
cursive writing and the D in cursive writing are made differently, so differently that you can't mistake them. But if you're only teaching manuscript writing, which is what they're trying to do, then you've got a whole bunch of dyslexic kids who can't decide where to put the circle on the B or the D or the P or the Q.
So true. So true.
Get
You know,
cursive writing
we're
back in the school. You can.
you know,
Shut up.
at the Rawson Institute, we're trying to create letter formation and sound practice exercises and put it out on our website for free. And we wanted to do cursive. We're going to do cursive and print because unfortunately so many kids aren't allowed to use cursive that they don't even know how to write the print either. So, but I want to go back to something you said about these children or these adults, these people showing up all these years later. I'll never forget when you said in your presentation, I think it was at Hood you said this. And like really, I was gonna fall off my chair. I was staring at the back of the president's neck when you were talking with this. I think you said the only reason you weren't kicked out of education and teaching was because you were the only one in that town of Riceville, Iowa, that knew how to teach all the dyslexics to read, and they were all dyslexics. And you're because this is genetic. This is genetic. By the way, this is
Yes.
the genetic thing. It is a real thing. Different brain architecture that shows up, and you could teach them and they would have gotten rid of you. So can you explain that about how because you could do the Orton-Gillingham, you were allowed to do this exercise in racism, how that worked together?
I could have taught the most insane things as long as I could teach every child in my classroom to read. Every child that came into my classroom left my classroom reading from the fourth to the sixth grade level. No matter what their problem was, no matter what their previous teachers said about them, I would say, well, they may be mistaken. Let me see if they're mistaken. And then I would teach them to read. And those kids would look at me like, wow, Mrs. Elliott. And I'd think, well, wow upside down spells mom. I'm going to teach you that tomorrow. But today we're going to learn about how you see words differently.
Oh,
Not everybody sees on and sees on. They see it, sometimes they see it no, and sometimes they see it upside down and see it ow. So what we have to do is train you to look up, see words the way they're written, and to use your hand, use your fingers to trace things so that you use all four pathways of learning: hearing, seeing, feeling, and tasting, so that you use all four
totally.
pathways of learning so that you constantly are reinforcing what I'm saying. This says on, on spells on. Okay, all right, Mrs. Elliott, if you say so. And then I've got it nailed in there that that kid now hears, sees,
Nailed
and
in
feels on.
there.
They It's just Orton-Gillingham, the way Anna S. Cunningham and Margaret Rawson and Jean, what's her name? Paula Rome and Jean
Osmond.
taught me, Jean Osmond taught people how to read was so natural and so elementary, but so positive that if we would use it with every child, everybody would be reading,
Correct.
every third grade would be reading at the fourth to sixth grade level at the end of the year. Because
Right.
if you do it and you're true to it, it's going to work. And those
Correct.
13 kids succeeded when they weren't supposed to. And the other two teachers called the other two third grade teachers called my group the dummy group. we're doing exciting things because I mean, John Dewey said we learn by doing. So we did lots of strange things in my class because I think you have to get the whole kid involved in education. And my kids would be doing something exciting, and the other kids would go to their teacher and say, "Why can't we do what Elliott's kids do?" Because that's the dummy group. That's the only way those kids can learn. So these kids were having a
Oh,
ball. They were fun in school, and school isn't supposed to be fun, but it could be interesting if they couldn't wait to get back to school in the morning. And oftentimes my kid would say, my third graders would say at the end of the day, "Can't we stay overnight? We can sleep on the floor. We don't want to go home yet." And I'd say, "I know you don't want to go home, but I'm tired. We've got to go home. I've got to go home, and you don't want to be here alone." "No, well then, but then you'll have to go home." "Okay, all right, we'll go home, but we'll be back in the morning." I say, "Yes, I'm sure you will." I'd stagger home
oh,
and get
Jane, when I watched I'm so glad that that documentary is there because honestly, when I watched, you would have the child at the board and you'd go up, up, up because you wanted them to make the motion in
right.
practicing the letter formation, or you were doing the Orton sound, the deck where they were going through the sounds and you were seeing how fast you could go through it. And you were very disciplined in covering everything and you were making the children do their work and they loved you. They loved you because you were empowering them to be successful and to do what they need. I just went and observed an Orton class in a public school system a couple weeks ago. Jane, during the lesson, the teacher let the children get on their cell phone and play games. Nothing to do with, these were children. The child I was there to observe is going into the ninth grade, and he is reading on a kindergarten first grade level in the Orton sequence. And while the children, it's a group of, I think it was 5 children. I still cannot believe this. The teacher would turn to one child to ask questions, and while they were doing that, the other children could get on their cell phone. There was no practice. There was nothing for them to do to integrate, to get that into memory, muscle memory. And they're calling this Orton-Gillingham. So the thing is, you can call anything Orton-Gillingham, but when you worked with those children, you ran a tight ship of practice. I could see how well your classroom was organized. You had the lessons, you had everything, and it was pure love there to give those children what they needed. I
But
so
but you have to remember if they didn't succeed, I hadn't succeeded.
I know, but
That's
the
what you have to
mentality
remember.
now
If
isn't that way. It's not that
but
way now.
if those kids don't succeed in learning how to read, that teacher has failed. You can't
Totally
fail
failed.
kids. If you're a
I
teacher
agree.
and those kids are failing consistently, then you are the one who's failing. You don't know how to teach those kids. And if you don't know how to teach those kids, and they comprise 20 to 30% of the population in some communities, more than
Correct.
that, who by God needs to be in a different line of work
Correct.
and let people who are willing to educate all the kids do the job that you are obviously unable to do.
Well, now you look at the data and you will see that children who aren't even dyslexic aren't reading, right? The reading programs are so bad that children, they can't even weed
But
out
they all know how to run what am I
phone.
saying here? Yeah, yeah, a telephone. They all know run how to
They
run a
all
cell
can
phone.
do
Or
that.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, just perfectly. And they could all teach me things that I should know how to do with that cell phone. But I don't know because that isn't something I think is important for people to know how to do. I think it's important
correct.
for people to know how to read, and then they can read the book that tells you how to run the cell phone.
Correct. Correct. I
But
mean,
first, you have to
this is,
be able to read.
that's
Reading
right.
is fundamental, and we're leaving where it's too much work to do it. It takes too long. So we just pass these kids on, get them out of here. They'll never amount to anything anyway. I'll never forget the day that man said that to me. And I thought, no kid will ever leave my classroom being passed on because they aren't ever going to amount to anything anyway. Every kid that came through my classroom left reading at above the fourth grade level. because of Orton-Slingerland phonics.
And that's where totally. I mean, and this comes from the colleges. They're not training the teachers found it, and that's what Margaret was up against. For all those, she started teaching at Hood in the 40s, retired in the 60s, but from the 40s to the 1990s, every president she went to try to get them to train the teachers. Now they offer something called Letters. It's a good program. Louisa Moats developed it. It's using the science of reading, and it teaches the foundational elements, but it's an elective course at the master's
Ah,
level. So that means all the teachers below aren't getting what they need, right? And to circle back,
so
when
you
I
can
was
so you can get a B you can get a BA in education without knowing how to teach kids how to read.
correct,
Yeah,
period. Put a
then that
period at
isn't
the end
correct.
of that.
That's incorrect. That is
That's right.
absolutely incorrect. There's nothing right
That's right.
about having teachers,
There's
people
nothing right.
going into the classroom who don't know how to teach every child how to read.
Well, here's the thing. Now they're being taught that there's this thing called the science of reading. There is. There's which has the science now has circled back to prove what Samuel Orton and Orton-Gillingham knew back then. It now substantiates that, except for one thing, Jane, which goes to what you said. It doesn't talk too much about multisensory teaching, which is what you're saying when
Mm-hmm.
you're saying you say it, see it, hear it. You use all the modalities at once. When I first
Right.
met Margaret, the first day I met Margaret Rawson, she opens up her book, The Many Faces of Dyslexia. She shows me this square. I don't have it near me, but she showed me what multisensory was. That was the first thing that woman showed me.
Right.
You have to do the multisensory all at one moment in time together to get, I called it brain glue anchored in the head and in the body, right? But she said
Mm-hmm.
they're doing it wrong. And then when my children went to school, they said, oh, he's an auditory learner. Oh, he's a visual learner. Oh, he's a whatever. But they never understood the principle of
Mm-mm.
multisensory. And the problem in the science of reading, it doesn't get into this. And there's one reason, because I asked, some of the researchers, why aren't you looking at multisensory? Because the boots on the ground, the practitioner, the teachers who use this know this is a key element in teaching effective reading, especially for a dyslexic child. Why aren't you highlighting this? And there's one reason. They can't test it in an MRI tube. So when someone's in the MRI tube, they can do certain things. They can see the activity of the
Oh,
brain, but you can't be in the tube making the letters and doing the multisensory piece. So it's not that it's not important, it's that it can't be tested to show the level of importance, right? It's like vitamins. If vitamins
yeah.
aren't funded by a pharmaceutical company, they're not going to test their effectiveness because there's no money behind it to be made. So it doesn't mean it doesn't work. It's just that it's not tested, right? So anyway, with this, the multisensory piece, Margaret always underscored is the most important, one of the most important elements to this. And it's not that it's ignored, it's just that it can't be calculated, the level of it. But
But it,
where we
but it can be calculated at the end of the year when the child who comes in reading at the kindergarten level leaves reading at the fourth to the sixth grade level in
totally,
9 months. You can calculate that and you can say, wait a
you can absolutely, when
minute, something happened
practitioners,
from the minute he put his foot in this class till the minute he left this classroom. It made a difference. Something
correct.
made a difference here. And what was it? Was the teacher's personality? No. Was
No,
the class book? Was the textbooks? No. They had the same textbooks next door. Well, what was it then? Same amount of time. What was it? The difference was multisensory learning and teaching. The
totally.
kid used used his touch, his sight, his hearing, and his teeth, his taste to learn how to read. He can eat the book because he knows how to read the words.
Absolutely. Jane, when I used to head a small school for dyslexic children, And we had one tutor there. She was a wonderful tutor. And she she would say they had to go home in the evening and do sustained oral reading. And we would give the book
Right.
very controlled, a grade level below where they were so that it was easy to build fluency and accuracy, speed, everything. And she would look at the parents and she would say, "We want your child to be so sick of reading this book out loud that they want to throw up the words." She would say, because we want them to say it over and over and it becomes so ingrained in them that they owned it, right? So she would call it throwing up, the words. I was like, Wendy, I don't know if we should say it that way, but it was, you know the point, right? It has to become so internalized to them. And it takes a little more time, takes more effort.
But
But there
reading,
wasn't
reading, reading,
one child.
reading,
Yeah,
but reading has to become so important that that is more important to that kid than being on the football team or the wrestling team. Because
anything.
when,
Yeah.
I was teaching third grade, and the teacher's aide would say to me, "I'm glad my son isn't in your class." I say, "Why?" "Because you have those kids reading all the time, and they can't watch television at night. And these kids have a right to be with their parents at night." And I'd say, "They aren't with their parents when they're in front of that television. Sit there in that set, and they aren't learning anything about reading." She said, "Oh, I'm glad my son isn't in your class." So then I moved up to junior high. And she came to me after about 3 months and said, "I'm so glad that you're teaching at the junior high level." I said, "Why is that?" She said, "Because I never see my son without a book in his hands. I am so glad he is so excited about reading." And I bit my tongue. I didn't say, "Look, fool, he could have been excited about reading for the last 3 years, but you didn't." Well, I didn't. I said, "Oh, I'm so glad. I'm glad he's." And he, to this day, he is an avid reader, because in junior high, when I got him, I said, "Here's the way it is, people. You will do an hour of sustained silent reading every night after school.
Totally.
In the third grade level, you only had to do half an hour, but at this level, I expect you to do an hour. And here's a list of books. Take a book, bring it back, and I'll sign it. Your parents will sign this slip that says you did an
Where
hour of
we did this
sustained
flip too.
reading. At,
Absolutely.
at, at the end of the week, you get a prize for doing
Absolutely.
what you did." And those kids just became readers, which
You,
today
to,
it's
they don't do it.
absolutely essential today, because there's information out there in books like The Power Worshippers. Everybody should read The Power Worshippers. Everybody should read some of the stuff that The Spider. Everybody should read that now. They should want to read so that they can vote themselves out of the mess we're in. So that they could vote in a reasonable way, because they know what's going on. Reading is absolutely fundamental.
Totally fundamental. I mean, I'm with you. We would require that they did this sustain, and we did oral reading, but and the parents had to sign these forms, and it meant that they couldn't be in all these after school activities and everything. And I remember one time a father came up to me. He said, "You are ruining our family. Like
Right,
you're
right.
messing, right?" Because they think the kid in front of the TV or whatever. And we said, here's what I said. You're paying a fortune for this education. We can't do it alone. We have to now fill grade levels of gap. Some 3 years, 4 years behind, whatever it was. They were so behind, right? We're It's not going to work unless you do what we're telling you. So you have to sign this form. You've got to take part in it. And if you don't want to do this, maybe this isn't the school for you, because your child, you can't look at us to close a 4-year gap in education in 1 year, make up 4 years doing it the way you've been doing it. And they would get so mad, but
Yeah,
it didn't
yep,
matter.
yep,
Their kids end up doing great. They did
yep.
they did it. But
one one parent called one parent called the principal while I was teacher and said, when before school started, and said, "I don't want my kid in that N-word lovers class, but I want him to learn to read, so put him in there anyway." So the principal put him in there anyway, and his kid learned to read, but he also learned not to be a racist. So, but the
there you go.
father could shake that out of him when he got him home, but he couldn't teach him to read. So he was willing to take the bitter with the sweet. "I'll let her teach him to read. Well, I'll be damn sure she doesn't teach him the rest of this stuff." He learned to read, and then he learned to
Right,
read what
because
his
you
father
weren't
was
going to
talking.
take him
He
if
gave it up.
right.
Yeah.
You go,
Well,
Jane, because if they were yeah,
I would have taken him anyway, but I was going to teach him to read whether his father wanted him to or not. That's my job. My job
right.
as an educator is to teach every person I can how to read. I don't care
Absolutely.
whether they can do math because they can get a computer and hitch the numbers in there and without knowing a thing about what they're doing, get the right answer. You can't do that with a
Absolutely.
book.
You cannot. No, you know, and for me, I was the principal. So when they called with that stuff, I would be like, this is what we do. This is just, this is what we used to do something called peace tables. So when a child was upset, they could call a peace table. Everyone had to come, put their hands on the table and listen, become a really good listener, and they didn't have to agree. They could disagree, they could pass, but everyone had to hear the other person out. And many times, just like your children in that class, the children would blow my mind. They would say, I never thought of it that way. I'm sorry
Yeah,
I did
right,
that. You know, the children.
right.
So then the children would go home and they would say to their parent, I want a peace table. And the parents were
Right.
like, what? It was like,
What the,
they and people would get upset with me. Like they didn't want all this crap. They just
uh-huh.
wanted whatever. I said, "No, I'm sorry. We're going to this is how we do it here. This is but it goes to the issue
But
that you're saying. All this
but
other
see
stuff.
but no, the first thing I taught my kids the day they came into my classroom every year, junior high, any place else, was the listening skills. Good listeners have quiet hands, feet, and mouths. Good listeners keep their eyes on the person who's speaking. Good listeners listen from the beginning to the very end. Good listeners decide to learn something. Those 4 steps made it unnecessary for me to do any disciplining. Because if you practice the listening skills, you got to put up a
Totally.
point for your row. And the row that had the most points at the end of the week got into the grab bag. Those kids practiced those listening skills as if I had a gun to their heads.
Totally.
I didn't have a gun to their heads. I had a sack in my hand that had little things in it that third graders loved. And I did the same thing at the junior high level. Those kids learn to listen, and 60% of what we learn comes to us through our ears. If you listen
Totally.
at all the time, you will learn twice as fast as it will if you don't listen. Listening is the number one skill you have to teach people of all ages. And I've taught it to high school people and college people. And I've said it when I've been speaking, I've said, you people don't know the listening skills, and I'm going to teach them to you at the college level. And everybody looks at me like, you're a real bitch. And then I teach them that bitch is an acronym for being in total control, honey. You go ahead and think of me in that way because that's exactly what I am. Thank you for the compliment. In the meantime, getting right along, these are the listening skills. Learn them, and practice them when you're in my presence because I'll stop what I'm saying and say to this whole group, this person doesn't know the listening skills, so you are to teach them to him. And then everybody pays attention because they may not like what I'm saying, but if they show that they aren't listening, they'll wish I had kept on talking instead of talking to them.
To completely. That's and you
Yeah.
can solve conflict, you can solve anything if you know how to listen. Because and
Yes,
you learn that you may not get your way. You can agree to
that's right.
disagree, but you're listening. So, Jane, will you repeat the listening skills for our listeners?
Oh, number one, good listeners have quiet hands, feet, and mouths. Now that gets rid of all the nose picking and all the thumb sucking and all the grabbing at their crotches. It gets rid, and they're writing while you're talking. Good listeners have quiet hands, feet, and mouths. Number two, good listeners keep their eyes on the person who's speaking. Where a child's eyes go, that's where his brain is going. Good listeners keep their eyes on the person who is speaking. And so if you're the teacher, you better be saying things that they need to hear. And if you're going to talk crap, shut up and teach them something they need to hear at that point. Number three, good listeners listen from the beginning to the very end. They don't stop in the middle and start scratching their head or playing with their hair or playing with the hair of the student ahead of them. They listen from the beginning to the very end. And number four, good listeners decide to learn something. If those kids have not decided to learn something, you might as well shut up. If they have decided to learn something, you'd better have something worthwhile for them to learn. You'd better have something that they need to learn. If you're just going to talk about what you did last night before bridge club, shut up and teach those kids something they need to learn. They do not need to learn that you're mad at your husband or that you're mad at your wife or that you don't like the neighbors or that you what or your politics. That's not what they're for. That's not what they're there for. They are there to learn something, and that's your responsibility. They decide to learn something, and you better say something that's worth listening to. Good listeners have quiet hands, feet, and mouths, keep their eyes on the person who's speaking, listen from the beginning to the very end, and decide to learn something. And that's what teachers should do. When a
But
kid is telling you something, that when a kid is
uh,
telling something to a teacher, the teacher should have quiet hands, feet, and mouths, should keep their eyes on the student who's talking, should listen from the beginning to the very end, and should decide to learn something from what that student is saying. Because if you don't practice the listening skills while those kids are talking to you, why in hell should they practice the listening skills while they're listening to you?
perfect. Spot on wisdom, Jane. Okay.
No,
I
learned responses. These are all learned responses. These are things I have learned as a result of teaching children who, in many cases, since I was teaching in a farming community, those boys knew more than I did. Those
right.
boys, those 9-year-old boys, knew more about animal husbandry than I will ever learn because they had to know. Those kids knew more than I did. And those boys were the ones, because they were male, who were most likely to drop out of school at the age of 16. Because those are the ones who are most likely to be dyslexic. 4 out of 5 dyslexics are males. Now, I didn't say that 4 out of 5 males are dyslexic. I said that 4 out of 5 males are dyslexic. 4 out of 5 dyslexics. 4 out of 5 dyslexics are males. If you got a whole room full of dyslexics, 80% of them are going to be boys.
Now they say I think the science is showing that it's 50-50 between girls and boys, but girls
Well,
surface differently.
I think the science is wrong. I
Okay?
think they're going to find out that 4 out of 5 dyslexics are males, but girls can hide it because they
That's
don't
what I'm
have
saying.
good
They
moral.
hide it. That's
Yeah,
right. They hide it.
girls are
That
hiding it, but boys can't hide it because boys have to be responsible 100% of the time, particularly after they graduate from high school. Girls
right.
can be
They
or not
can't.
be because
That's right.
women
That's the
women
issue.
depend on men. Men depend on their intelligence. I'm sorry, nobody's going to want to hear that. I know nobody's going to hear that,
No
but
one's going to
that's
hear
the way.
that, but yeah. Nope.
That's they don't have to.
Right. The thing is the way that it surfaces with girls. So when I was in school, all right, in the early 1960s, when I'm in the second grade, I remember walking down to I was in the second grade, but I had to go down to the first grade classroom to be taught reading because I wasn't reading, right? So I remember walking down this big hallway. They would send me down to the first grade room. And one time my mother was there and the principal, and I remember her. Mrs. Yeager. She was scary. And I went to a school, it was called Belvedere. And if the principal came up to you, you had to spell the word of the school, Belvedere. Now,
Huh.
for dyslexic in the first and second grade, to spell Belvedere, you might as well shoot me. Like I was scared to death. I couldn't spell Belvedere, but I learned how. I made like a song out of it. But I remember my mother saying, why can't my daughter learn to read? What's going on? And the principal, Mrs. Yeager, said, she needs phonics. And she whispered phonics because I didn't realize
Oh,
in Fairfax County, Virginia, right outside of DC, in the 60s, they went from teaching phonetically to the whole language approach. And they weren't allowed to
yeah.
teach phonics. They weren't even allowed to say the word phonics, apparently. And what's so funny is she told my mother to buy these records for me.
Oh,
Yeah. And I was a little kid and the that my mother, what does my mother do? She hands me the records. That's all she did. And I was
ah,
in the second grade. I made a little chart for myself of
ah,
listening to the records. And I listened to the record one time, and that's all I did. I didn't really understand what to do. But the thing was, here's the point that I'm getting at with this. You now have generations of teachers. They were not raised on any of this. They don't know the
mm-mm.
sounds of the letters. They weren't. I have college students who can't read my cursive writing on the board. I write in cursive.
Right.
They can't read it. So, how the heck are these teachers supposed to teach the science of reading if they don't know the sounds of the letters? They don't know the phonics principle. They weren't raised on it, and they're not teaching it in college. So, you have this generations now of te- of children who aren't going to have access. It's like a lost art, right? It's missing.
Right.
So that's what I
That's right.
really see happening a lot in the public system. There's this wave
It
now
isn't just in
wanting.
the public system, it's also in the private schools. It's
Oh,
also in the
totally.
it's in the schools, it's in every school that calls itself a school, unless it's an art and train situation. And if teachers
Correct.
aren't trained in Orton-Gillingham phonics, they don't know how to effectively teach every child
Correct.
to read. And if they are trained in Orton-Gillingham phonics, kids make progress that they never made before they came to that grade. None of those
Correct.
kids that are in that film you saw were supposed to finish high school. They all finished high school except one who was killed in an automobile accident 2 weeks before graduation, and he was ready to graduate. So the fact that these kids can't learn is a lie. The problem is
Correct.
teachers can't teach them unless they can teach them look,
Correct.
say, or whole word, whole language. Oh my God, what we're doing with reading today is an absolute crime, in my
Yeah.
estimation.
Right. And they would say,
And I'm
"Oh,
not.
we're using a mixed approach." Like if they were
Oh,
even I mean, it's a mess. It's all a mess.
but
And
what
then
that
when you
means is we're mixing everybody. We're mixing up everybody instead of just a few. We're mixing up the whole bunch. None of them know, and they don't develop respect for one another or respect. See, I also taught the 3 R's of rights, respect, and responsibility. You had to respect the rights of every child in the classroom, and if you don't, you were held responsible for it. I think the 3 R's of rights, respect, and responsibility are more important than the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic, only one of which begins with R.
absolutely, Jane. And I'm going to circle back to this issue of race in education with what you're saying too, because there was a study that was done in Baltimore. I believe that his last name was Kettleman, but I'm blanking on his first name. But what he showed was that for children of color, when they were tested, the testing showed this innate bias in showing a lower IQ, a lower innate ability. So within the testing, and I remember Margaret would say this, that the IQ testing is all language based testing. It's heavily based on language. And I
But
saw one time,
it's also sociologically based. If
totally
we're just based,
sociological. Yes.
yeah, oh yeah, it's all about sociology. It's all about what who we will raise expectations for this child because he answered this way on these questions.
Correct. I saw one time these anthropologists in Australia. They took Aboriginal children and uh, European children, and they had a table, and they made squares on the table, and they put rocks in the squares. So they had children come in and look at the table, and um, then they would have the children leave the room. They move the rocks around. They would ask the Aboriginal children, "Can you put this back the way it was?" And they could move they actually notice the difference. The other children didn't even know anything had happened. If that was the IQ test right there, the Aboriginal children would have been off the chart in that test, right? So to show the
Right,
cultural bias, right? So the thing was, in this testing in Baltimore, the children of color and from certain backgrounds, economic backgrounds, and so forth, they were perceived as lower innate ability. And then you have this culture of low expectation and the wrong labeling of children
right,
and
right,
how that impacts children of color and the expectation and this focus on behavior, like this child that I went in to observe recently, that I watched them being allowed to be on the cell phone. This low expectation, as though because he's going into the ninth grade and he can't read, he'll never learn. They don't feel an
mm-hmm,
obligation to teach him to learn. So anytime
mm-hmm.
you can funnel children into their behavioral programs or label them as emotionally or behaviorally disturbed, that's another arena of misdiagnosing children of color. You can see the funnel. You can see the mislabeling, the low expectation, and it's so structurally profoundly unfair. And many times the parents don't know what to look for, what they should be doing or needing to get their children out of this loop. So when my children couldn't read, they were put in Title I classes. And they're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, we have an extra teacher in the room. As if so all these
Another person, another person who doesn't know what the hell she's doing.
That's exactly what it was. And so these disadvantaged children of color and my kids in there and other children, they're getting they're getting shit. They're getting nothing because they have a breathing body in the room who doesn't know anything, and then they crack down on behavior. So then you have like the one child you said with the psoriasis or the stress or the teachers that
Mm-hmm.
hit on them.
Yeah.
The things I observed when I went in to observe in the classroom, the way they treated these children, Jane, I was trying to protect my kids, but all of a sudden I'm looking at all these other children, how they're being treated, and no one's in there protecting them. Schools are like a place of great public trust. These are violations of public trust. It's like sending your kid
That's right.
off to church and they're being abused in there, and no one's thinking that can happen in there because they're all teachers and they're all. It was crazy. Like, and so really, this race issue, and when all you have to do is look at the reading scores to see that in every one of these communities, these children are being placed even at a further disadvantage than the already disadvantaged based on, like you said, pigment color of skin or
But no,
gender.
no, no. That's wait. That's not what it's based on. It's based on teachers' ignorance. It's based
Correct.
on the self-imposed ignorance of the teachers who see
Correct.
skin color as a negative or a positive.
Right.
And if you see skin color as a negative, you're going to force those brilliant children, many of whom are brilliant, to live
Brilliant.
down to the expectations of your
Totally.
self-imposed ignorance. It has nothing to do with skin
Absolutely.
color. It has to do with teachers' ignorance. And nobody
Absolutely.
who makes racist statements belongs in the classroom. You want to be a racist?
Absolutely.
Go be a janitor.
But it's even more subtle than a racist statement. It's so internalized. If you can make an excuse that when your students are underperforming because of all this wrong thinking, it's not even what they're saying. It's like you said, the proof is in the pudding. If you can pass children along and they can't read, end of discussion. Just end of discussion. Margaret Rawson was in a school in Pennsylvania that she helped create with other parents in the 1920s. And in that school, she was the librarian. She was volunteering in the library. And they would send all the boys who were misbehaving down to the library. And she noticed a pattern. They couldn't read. So what did she do? She took it upon herself. They had a teacher who just came from New York, and she said the one child should go meet with the neurologist, Samuel Orton. And he did. And Samuel Orton said he needs to be taught this way. Who's going to be the teacher there that will teach him Orton-Gillingham? It was Margaret in the library. And that's when she learned from Paula Dozer some of these
Mm-hmm.
techniques. And she met Anna Gillingham. And I don't think Anna wanted her to have her manual. There's some story about how she borrowed the manual or something because she wanted to learn the principles. And she went up the learning curve. What do you remember? Do you remember Paula Rome or Gina? What do you have some memory of something they said to you that really stands out for you? These
Well, they talked about Gene Osmond talked about Paul Rome, who was her. She was his. He was her uncle, right?
Right.
So
Paul Dozier
yeah,
was Paula Rome's uncle.
yeah, yeah. And she talked about him every once in a while, but she was so busy teaching us how to teach reading that she was absolutely intent on doing that and nothing else. And that's what she did. If what I learned from that woman was, here's what you're here for, here's what we're going to do, Here's what you're going to learn as a result of it. And we're not going to go off topic. Paula Rome taught us that here's the way to do this job. And you do this job, and if something else comes up, you're still doing this job.
Right.
You be sure that everything about Orton-Gillingham phonics can relate to everything else in the classroom day. Everything in a classroom can be filtered through Orton-Gillingham phonics. And if it isn't, at least 20 to 30% of your students aren't going to learn to read well. But
Right.
if everything that you do is because you know Orton-Gillingham phonics, if you know all the ways to spell the long E sound, and you've seen that page in this textbook that shows you all the ways to spell long E, all you have to do is go get it and say, now, boys and girls, look at here. Here are all the ways to spell the E sound. Look at here, all these ways you can spell this. You have to figure out which one is right. And if you haven't figured out, then you go to the dictionary. You teach them how to use the dictionary, and then they go and find out which spelling for long E they should have used. She taught us to use every area of education, but every area of education as it
Yeah.
related to reading, because every area of
Absolutely.
education relates to reading. You cannot succeed in physics if you don't know how to read. Now, you can succeed as a coach if you don't know how to read. In fact, a whole lot of coaches are dyslexic. You know that, and I know that. They
Yeah.
can't, we'll not discuss that. However, there are practically every area of learning includes knowing how to read. That's all there is to it.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Jane. Well, I know we've taken so much of your time, and as we start to wind down, and see, you make reading and just the way it's a priority. It's a life access. It's a priority, and I remember the history of Frederick Douglass and
Yeah,
the ability, the importance when he learned to read. And he one time hits the quote I have on my refrigerator is the limits of tyrants is prescribed by the endurance that they possess, right? The willingness to go along with this. And I think, and my
right.
hope is that what we're trying to do is expose how long there are people that know that every child, maybe 1%, maybe 0.5% of people can't be taught to read, but the rest, everybody can, right? And that
Yep,
this is
yep.
should be the priority. All this other junk and all this other stuff that they're doing that takes away from a child's ability to read and form their own critical thoughts. I mean, our democracy depends on the ability to read. And so dumbing
But you see
people
that
down,
that's that's exactly the reason they are doing away with the Department of Education, because the Department of Education was instrumental in seeing to it that every child learned to read. The
but they
Department of
didn't do a very
Education was
good job. The
well,
Department of
but
Education,
at least they tried, and that isn't even
in
now. We are doing
theory,
away with
yeah,
the education. It is terrifying that they would do away with the one thing that could make a difference in the level of civilization that these kids experience
well,
and that exercise when they get out of school. The less able you are to read, the less able you are to learn about history, and those who forget the mistakes of the past are doomed to repeat them.
correct.
Reading is
Absolutely.
absolutely essential if you want to have a civilized society. I don't say civil, I say
Absolutely.
civil. You have to learn to read. And right
You
now we
have to
are
learn to read.
discouraging teachers from teaching reading, and we're giving them all these little machines, and kids can sit in front of those machines and hit the right key
Yeah,
and never learn how to do cursive writing and never learn how to spell. And
right.
that's what's
That's all been
happening with
stripped. Totally.
20 to 30% of our students today are not learning how to read or how to spell. And this is
Right.
absolutely essential that they learn those things,
Right.
because, oh, shut up, Jane. I know how to shut up, but it's difficult. It's real
No,
difficult.
you're spot on. And that's the thing. I hope for the listeners that this love, this
wait a minute.
passion.
Get the book. Wait a minute. Get the book, John Money's book, Dyslexia and Your Child. Have you read it?
No.
John
I
Money,
ha-
I think the name of it is Dyslexia and Your Child, written by John Money. Read that book. Anybody who's listening to this who has doing homeschooling, get that book. And then get this Orton-Gillingham uh, training manual. It'll cost you a fortune, but it will be worth every dime you put into it. You'll regret the years that you didn't have this training manual, because if you're teaching reading and you aren't teaching phonics, you aren't teaching reading,
Right.
because you can't teach reading if you don't know phonics. You can teach look, say, but that doesn't tell you where that word came from, how many ways there are to spell that word, how many meanings there are for those all those different spellings, and it's time for us to learn more than we have learned up to this point.
Right.
It's not, I don't want you
Okay.
to think that I'm opinionated, of course, but but I think if every teacher would take a course in Orton-Slingerland phonics or Orton-Gillingham phonics, whichever you want to call it, if every teacher would take a 2 week or 3 week course in that, every child, practically every child, would leave school reading at the 12th grade level, and some of them would leave reading at the 16th grade level. I've seen it happen. I've done it. I know what can be done.
Absolutely. It's so true. That's the message, right, Jane? And anything else that in wrapping up, because I appreciate all your time. Anything else that stands out that you want to make to highlight, because it's so, and I've experienced it. You teach the right way, you will teach a child to read. And there's no excuse. That's your job if you're a teacher.
That's right. My father would say, you can't judge a book by its cover or a man by his skin. And that's the truth. But if you can't teach children to read and you have a number of students in your room who are melanotic instead of melanemic, you can decide for yourself in your own little mind that probably these melanotic children aren't going to be as bright as these melanemic ones are. And that may sound so silly to you, but that's exactly what's happening. When that child whom you call black comes into the classroom and you say, oh, here's another little black boy, you should lose your job at that point. Because if that's what you see when you see that child, you see a black boy, you are seeing somebody who is going to be regarded as savage and evil by you and by the other students in that classroom, because that's the way black came into being as a color for skin. And it was a lie then, and it's a lie now. We've got to get rid of the word black. And when that little girl comes in, she says, oh, and little white children. That girl is not white. There are no white children. But white means purity and goodness. Black means savagery and evil. Those two terms have been used to describe people long enough. Look up Torquemada, Torquemada, and read and find out why we got stuck on black and white. People do not come in those two colors, folks. Human beings do not come in black and white. They come in shades of brown, and they did during the Spanish Inquisition until Torquemada decided he was going to separate people into white and black so that he would know who deserved to die. And if you separate people into white and white means good and pure, and black means savage and evil, then obviously those who are good and pure have the right, in fact, the necessity, the responsibility to kill those who are savage and evil. And that's what we have been doing in this country for the last 300 years and all over the world since the late 1400s. I think people don't realize where this came from, how stupid it is. But if you're going to continue to to talk the way they talked during the Spanish Inquisition, that all the men have to come to school wearing short knee breeches and powdered wigs, and all the women have to wear corsets so tight that their waists are no more than 18 inches around. Now, if you don't want to go back to living the way they did in the 14 and 1500s, by the gods of war, stop speaking the way they did in the 14 and 1500s. Come into the 21st century. Give up black and white and start seeing people as they are, shades of brown.
That I remember Alex Huxley said the revolution is complete when the language is perfect. So the revolution is complete when the language is perfect. So when we speak that language, we are perpetuating something that's gone on for decades of wrong thinking used to discriminate and legitimize the the taking down of one group over another. So give it up.
We've been
And then
using
if you're not
we've been using we've been using language to kill people in
right,
this country for the last 300 years. We are
right,
killing people on the basis of the words we use to describe them. We've got to change
correct.
our description of people, because as long as you are separated into white and black, you are at polar opposites, and you will never realize that we are all 30th to 50th cousins. You and I are 30th to 50th cousins, whether you like it or not. That's the way it is,
That's
because
right.
you and I have ancestors that came from the same place. And here's another thing we have to do. Right now, we're talking about putting religion in the schools. People, where do you think we got the names for the days of the week? Monday is Mon's Day. Tuesday is Tuesday. Wednesday is Woden's Day. Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is Freya's Day. And Saturday is Saturn's Day. And Sunday is the Sun's Day. Those are all gods and goddesses. And where did we get the names for the days of the month? Well, weeks, the months of the year. Janus, January. February, February. Mars, Mars. Avril, April. March, April, June. June, Juno. People, those are all gods and goddesses. You have to realize we haven't taken religion out of the schools. But however, it's time to take the words under God out of the pledge because they put it just before the word indivisible. And when you put the words under God in the pledge, you divide the students who are saying it into those who believe in the right God and those who don't believe or who may not believe in God at all. We have to remember that Jesus had kinky woolly feet and kinky woolly hair and feet of bronze. Now, when you go to a church, when you go to church and look at the picture of Jesus behind the minister, I'll bet you he's going to have long, slightly brown hair and fit pale skin. That isn't the picture of Jesus. Jesus had kinky woolly hair and feet of bronze. I want us to see Jesus as he was instead of as we have constructed him. Another social construct. Jesus was an Ethiopian Jew. Jesus was an Ethiopian Jew. Here are three things I want everyone to remember. Number one, shut up, Jane. Just a minute, Daryl. He's been dead for 15 years, 13 years, but he keeps telling me, shut up, Jane. Number one, without what we call blacks, there would be no what we call whites. That's a fact. But they weren't black, and we aren't white. Without Jews, there would be no Christians. Jesus was an Ethiopian Jew. Without women, there would be no men. Period. Because of periods. Now, folks, you have to remember those three things. Without what we call blacks, there would be no what we call whites. Without Jews, there would be no Christians. And without women, there would be no men. Now, if we could do away with racism, sexism, and what's the third one? Sexism. The second was anyway. Those three. If we could do away with anti-Semitism, sorry about that, sexism, racism, anti-Semitism, and sexism, then we could use all our energy on all those other isms. So let's do away with those three. Let's do away with just those first three. Make sense to you?
Absolutely. And if you teach Orton-Gillingham, you'll know how to spell ism. You'll know how to spell those words.
And you'll know how to look them up, and you'll know what they mean.
You'll know how to use a dictionary, which, yeah, because we have someone on our board, Marcia Mann. She was trained by Margaret. She's so wonderful. She's a speech pathologist, and her thing is they're not teaching the dictionary anymore, right? So anyway,
but you also need to know how. You also ought to be made aware of the thesaurus. You have to know how to use Roget's thesaurus because the words in there are absolutely, it's amazing the way you increase your vocabulary by being introduced to Roget's thesaurus.
Absolutely. Margaret Rawson would say, teach the language as it is to the child as he or she is. So the language, it's more than just teaching. To teach reading it's so much more than just teaching phonics. It's the thesaurus, it's the dictionary, it's the language as it is. We live with a language that has deep roots, just like you were showing days of the week and months of the year. We find ourselves in the year 2025 coming from a ancestral lineage through time that it's important not to lose that history. And that's why, Jane, I so appreciate you taking the time with us today because Margaret, you went to Margaret's house, you met Margaret, we sat in her yellow kitchen with the blue dishes on her shelf. I mean, she was this brilliant woman, right? And we both have been influenced by the people whose lives she's touched or herself. And we know that there's no excuse to leave children behind. There's no reason to do this and no reason to discriminate against any human being the way that our system has been set up to do. And so I thank you for your life's work, Jane, who you are, what you've done. I see and appreciate you completely. I get it. And thank you.
Well, if we could just get every teacher, K through 12, to learn how to teach Orton-Gillingham phonics, we would have no dropouts
Right.
because most of
No,
those dropouts are forced outs. Those are
forced.
people who the teachers don't know how to teach, and so they discourage them. And eventually, when they're 16, there's an excuse for getting them out of school, so we don't have to be responsible for them anymore. If we taught
Right.
the 3 R's of rights, respect, and responsibility, we wouldn't have dropouts because teachers would be expected to respect the rights of every child, and the right of every child is to learn to read at or above grade level, period. And if you've got a student in your class that doesn't read at grade level, you keep that student there until he does. And if he doesn't, it's because you don't know how to teach him.
Totally. I so agree. And Jane, and I know it's taking longer than we ever planned, but it's good to get this all recorded and documented because one thing just to share, I used to go into schools as a substitute. And here in Prince William County, Virginia, I went into a school, it was a high school, and they wanted me to, it was a program within a program. It was called the Johnson program. These were kids who all had parole officers, I was told, and they were one more threat, they were going to be kicked out of high school. So I go down into this school within a school, sit in a room. This gentleman showed me the room, and they were all on the computer. He said, "Your job is to sit in this room." And I went in there and sat in the room, and I looked at the backs of all these young black men, these children of color. Some were Hispanic, mainly young men sitting there and their backs looking at the computer screen. And I'm wondering, what the heck are they watching on the computer screen? So I got up and I looked, and they're watching YouTube, drugs, drugs, um, music, inappropriate stuff on the computer. And I thought they're doing this while I'm in the room. And so I go outside in the hallway and I get this man that was in the hallway, and I said, "Excuse me, can you help me?" He goes, "You're new here." I said, "Yeah, I'm substituting. I think they're getting into YouTube and things they shouldn't be watching." You know what he said to me, Jay? He said,
They're being
"Your
quiet, aren't
job,
they?
your job is just to be in the room. We let them watch this." I said, "You're letting them watch this violent, drug-induced stuff in the classroom?" He said, "Yeah, because they're just going to go home and watch it there. So we let them watch it here." Talk about low expectation. So I go back in the room with these kids, high school kids, after this man said that to me. He wasn't going to help me get them off of there. I said, "Excuse me, is this what you do all day?" They said, "Yeah." And one kid said, "How is this supposed to teach me to read? I can't read." Jay, I mean, picture this. I mean, you cannot make this. You cannot make this shit up. Honestly, I'm
No,
sitting in there. They're on there, and I said, "This is what you're watching all day." I said, "I need to tell you something. You're being fed shit. This is shit. This is not okay. That this is what you're. This is not education for you. This is not okay." And then they loved me. They turned around. They looked at me. They said, "How are we supposed to learn like this?" I said, "You can't learn like this. Somehow, I don't know how, but you need to hear my words. This is not okay. This will not teach you, but somehow you need to know you're worthy of so much more than this. You are so worthy. I'm going to turn in this to the principal, at the end of the day, this is not okay. And you're worth so much more. You need to believe that. You need to find that in yourself. You need to hear these words. You're worth so much more than this." And I went down to the substitute office and I said, I'm filing a complaint. I need to speak with the principal, what these kids were watching. And I didn't get a call back. You know what the principal's message through the office was? "I don't want to get involved. You need to find
oh,
the director of this program, this Johnson program. You need to find him." So I said, "I want a meeting with the job." And guess who the director was? The man in the hallway. The man in the
yeah.
hallway who told me, "You're new here. This is what we let them do." So I met with him.
Mm-hmm.
I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, they're just going to go home." And then he blamed the superintendent of the system. He blamed everybody else. He had this standard for them. So then I volunteered to go, so there was no one was listening to me. No, I mean, absolutely. I sorry, I get so upset when I think about it because those children were being programmed to sit in a prison for the rest of their life. Their
That's
their
right.
their
That's right.
their route, seeing the backs of these young men staring at that computer screen, where was their life going to go? So I went in and I volunteered to be a speaker, and I was in the room and I sat there in the middle of the room, and they had this, it was like sitting, I mean, they were so feral. They were so out of control. Even if I talked, they didn't have the listening skills. They couldn't, they had no ability, even neurologically, to control themselves, to listen. And I started sharing the story of my grandparents. And then I asked them, "Where are you from? And where's your grandparents from?" And no one, they were rootless. Rootless. They didn't know where they were family was from. They didn't know any of their stories. They had no foundational skills. They were just, it was a breeding ground of decay for them. But then
Right.
slowly, I showed them, slowly they came around, and when by the time the principal came in at the end of the class, we were all gathered around a table, and I was having them watch this documentary on children in Rwanda who survived the machetes and the genocide
Right.
there, to show them that things are worse in some places actually, and how they were coming out of it, and they were engaged. But Jane,
Yep.
this was happening in the school, in the school. So this wasn't bad parenting outside the school. This was in the school. So, I mean, I don't know how you overcome this kind of garbage, but it's,
I'll tell you how you do it. You go to school board meetings. You go to
yes,
school board meetings as a group and you say to the members of the board, here are the things that are going to be stopped in this school. These kids are not going to be, we are not going to babysit these schools, and we aren't going to hire instructors at high wages to babysit these kids. We're going to educate these students. We're going to educate
that's
every
right.
one of them. And we, as parents, are going to be there to see to it that these kids are educated instead of babysat with. And we're going to do it starting
Absolutely.
tonight. And you need to go to the
Absolutely.
school. You need to scare the administrators out of their
That's
skin, scare them into a different form of work, because they are not administering education. They are administering the beginning of prisoners. They are educating people to go
absolutely.
along to get along. By God, we can't educate kids to go along to get along. And if you think you can, you look at what we have in this country today for a
Yeah.
president. This is the result of not of kids being on their computers and on their handheld devices instead of in a book.
Well, I totally agree that parents and people have to go to the school board meeting. And that is what I've
Absolutely.
marched around in so many school board in my area. Parents who were speaking up and going to school board meetings, this is, under the other president, were considered terrorists, domestic terrorists. I've been considered a terrorist when you speak up at these meetings. So like
That
it's
you need
crazy.
hey, you need to but you need to scare the hell out of these people who
I
are
know you
turning
do.
those schools into places that are just babysitting. You need to
Correct.
scare them out of the
That's right.
profession and scare them into some
Unacceptable.
other line of work, and make them responsible for what it is they're getting paid to do.
Absolutely.
And they are
And it doesn't,
getting paid to
that's right.
babysit those children. They're getting paid to
Absolutely.
educate those children for the future. What we teach in the present is going to determine what happens in the future in this country. And we're
That's
seeing
right.
the results of the last 20 years right now. We're seeing that
Absolutely.
right now. We've re-educate students who are in school to say, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. And instead of saying, you're too young, you can't do anything about it, we need to say, wait a minute, you're right, there is something wrong here. Let's all go to work and put a stop to it. Let's complain. Let's make
Absolutely.
enough noise that these folks either change what they're doing or put us out of here, and then we'll make enough noise for somebody else. But they want
That's
to. They
right.
want to put all those kids out of school because that's how they get their tax money. Is because there are kids in that building. So if all the kids' parents say we're taking our kids out until you want to have a decent education system, then they'll change their behavior. But they won't change their
That's right.
behavior. Parents go to work and say, here's what's wrong and here's what you need to fix.
Jane, on that note,
We
we'll
better
keep
stop.
being a flea. Thank you, Jane, for everything. I'll reach back around, but thank you for all your time.
Well,
Thank
that's
you.
no problem. I've enjoyed listening to you. I've enjoyed being with you, and I enjoy educating because I think to lead people out of ignorance, we can change the whole situation by we if we lead people out of ignorance and out of the self-imposed ignorance of racism.
Absolutely, Jane. Thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you, Jane.
thank I appreciate it.
Bless you. Thank you for all you've done. Take care.
Well, I haven't done anything, but I'm going to keep on doing just what I've done because the problem is not getting smaller. If they want me to shut up, all they have to do is change the level of racism in this country, and I'll be glad to shut up. They can keep me off colleges and university campuses, but they can't shut my mouth. Unfortunately for them. So we'll talk another time. Okay, goodbye now.
Good. Bye, Jane.